Hello, it's Amanda from Suddenly Autistic, and in this video I want to share my thoughts around a concept of taking things literally. Now, people with autism, or people who are autistic, depending on how you want to say that, are often talked about as having a trait of taking things or tendency to take things literally. And before I was diagnosed, I knew that of autism and felt, if ever I did question autism in me or my family, that I certainly didn't do that. It wasn't something that I felt so described me. But weirdly enough, once I got my diagnosis and started to inquire more and pick apart my own thoughts and my feelings and how I derived my feelings from my emotions, the information I took in and how I processed that, I could see that taking things literally very much described what I was doing. Although that isn't the end of the process. So in this video, I want to give some examples to illustrate that, and I also want to discuss the taking things literally in regards to two factors that I think really influence what happens next for me in my brain. Those two factors are the level of action that's required of me and the emotionality of the situation. Hopefully, using those two, I suppose, scales, that scale, and graphing out, almost like in a graph with, if you can imagine, 4 quadrants with low emotionality, low required action, low emotionality, high required action, and then high emotionality, low requirement for action, and high emotionality, high level of action, that kind of thing, existing on a continuum and non-static. So we don't tend to live, we don't get handed a scenario like we're playing a game and then have all the time in the world to process that scenario. We are encountering situations, or situationships as I call them, all the time, and the dynamics of those situations change as time, resources, people that are involved, whatever, as the world moves on. While I'm describing some of these things as static events, that's because I'm doing it retrospectively. In reality, all of this is going to be happening in a dynamic way, and a situation that's low emotion, low need for action could become one that's high emotion and high need for action within that same situation. But we start off simply because that's easier then to track and evaluate. So that's what I'm going to do today, sharing some of my own examples. I hope you find it interesting and helpful. Before I go on, I want to take a moment to confirm my understanding of taking things literally. Taking things literally is to interpret what is said as stated with no subclause. So what is said is exactly what is meant. I enjoy writing, I enjoy reading, and I do enjoy wordplay, metaphor, stories, all of that kind of thing that non-literal language brings to our lives. It's an enriching situation. To say that everything should be literal and all communication should have some literal, why wouldn't we take what is said as read? If you say, oh, I'm feeling a bit cold today, why wouldn't it be that person is feeling cold, as in their body temperature is a little on the chilly side, rather than they're feeling emotionally empty or lonely or sad? When I started making this video, I wanted us all to take a moment to think about the whole thing, the whole description of taking things literally, and what is said is what is meant. And question, well, why is that so odd? Why is that so confusing and so difficult for people to do? But then I thought about it some more, and as I said, I realised that I enjoy and can cope with taking things expansively or creatively or multidimensionally, or as an analogy, sorry. So I didn't think that it was right for me to sit here and make a video about taking things literally and then bag out the neurotypical habit of being non-direct in their communication, because I enjoy non-direct communication too. Also, what I thought was where the crux of the issue with this non-literalness, or the tendency then for people with autism or autistic people to be known as taking things literally, is not actually about literal speech. It's more, I think, to do with concrete black and white type of thinking instead of this expansive nature. Metaphors and nuances and idioms, etc., could be understood by anybody, autistic or not, I'm assuming, based on their schooling of those ways of using language, their cultural understanding, the norms of their society, their intellectual capacity, and their enjoyment of wordplay, and their capacity to process information in that way, at that time, in that situation. And I think that's where we start to get more at the autistic way of things. So with that, I'd like to say that, yeah, taking things literally is that what is said is exactly what is meant. I do believe that there are times when it's critical that people talk directly to each other. And an example of this will be where there's instructions to be given. It should be non-ambiguous when there's instructions, especially to do with safety or social cohesion. In other times, which is the majority of communication that we have as humans, non-literal communication is the stuff of relationships. And while I think we should all be mindful that there are, if you're going to talk in flowery ways, there's going to be many ways of people receiving that information, then a good, honest, open and trusting relationship is essential between the two. So the more you deviate from the literal communication style, the more there has to be trust and mutual respect and understanding of how your message may be received and interpreted. And again, that is key. That is so important. And I think that's where the gap is, to be honest. So with that, hopefully a bit clearer as to what I'm thinking, I want to move on to some of my examples of the emotionality action quadrants. I want to start off with giving you some examples from my life of low emotion examples of where I have taken on board information given to me in the way that it wasn't intended. Let's probably stick with that for now, and then I can interrogate the literal something else meaning maybe a bit later. So these are typically everyday things. So I give you some examples now. So if I go to a scenario where there is no action required and it's not emotional in as much as a triggered action emotion. And for me, action could be positive or negative. It's just an action, something that moves you. In this, I have focused on negative emotions as being the action, so a stress or a friction. This stress or a friction has been my focus because as somebody who's autistic, who has trauma, complex PTSD and anxiety disorder, action that is not stressful is not a problem. And I'm sure that's the same for everybody. We all wish to have a life where when we have to act, or if we don't want to act, whatever the action status of life is, we feel comfortable and safe, and we're in that rest and digest and feed and breed quadrant, whatever it is. So when I'm talking about action, there is a level of pressure or friction that is implies in my examples that there's some level of discomfort. It may not be a traumatic event per se. It may not be anything of great significance or that takes such a long time to process, but it's something that takes me out of that zone of comfort and into some action zone. And another bit of information about that is being autistic, I'm in my own bubble naturally. And so any externality that comes into my sphere, I suppose, and then requires some attention from me is somewhat disturbing. Disturbing's a bad word. I'm really not good at my words today. I'm a little bit tired. I'm very tired, actually. I'm quite exhausted. But basically, yeah, my safest place is when I'm not being acted upon. When I'm being acted upon, it's already taking me a little bit towards the edge of that safe zone. So looking at the first one, so no action is required and it's not an emotional situation. This is a typical example of this would be, say, scrolling on your social media through some of the groups or people that you follow and looking at content that is pleasant, that is something that sort of mildly resonates with you, but it's passing you by. So you might be scrolling through and you don't need to do anything with this. It's entertainment. You're consuming or participating in that media passively and can choose the level of engagement you want. So you might choose to like it, to share it, to create something from it, learn something from it, go off on a tangent and expand that moment, or you might just watch it and then it goes and it doesn't so much become a part of you. When I say it's not emotional, that's not true. There's some emotion in that, and there was some curation. If it's your social media, you've chosen to follow these people for some reason, so it's a pleasant emotion, but it's low on the negative emotion scale. That is one example. There are some more examples, and I have another example of this sort of low thing, and this was low emotion, low need for action, and this was when I came across an advert for a film that was coming up at the time. Now, in this zone, I call it my green zone, it's very safe. So I'm feeling safe and secure and happy. And in that frame of mind, I came across an advert for a film called The Triangle of Sadness. I immediately started giggling to myself about that, thinking that was really amusing. In that moment, I read the words and I was able to, without even thinking, totally disregard any other clues that were coming across with those words, i.e. the poster with the image of the people on a boat dressed up, etc. That meant nothing to me. It didn't even, I wouldn't say it meant nothing, because clearly I remembered it because I'm telling you now, but it wasn't important it didn't add anything then to how my brain was taking the signal. So the bit I chose to focus on was the words, the Triangle of Sadness. And why I found it so funny is because back in my history, I've heard of ladies' privates being described as triangles. I live in Australia, and there's an old comedian that described it as the map of Tasmania, because that's kind of in a triangle shape. So I have some connection in my brain, like maybe primary school childish humour, that triangles are representative of women's genitalia. So when I heard or saw this advert for the film called The Triangle of Sadness, being a middle-aged perimenopausal woman, I thought that was hilarious because it felt like something me and my friends would talk about. Oh, it used to be so much fun down there, but now it's just a triangle of sadness. That's not true, by the way, but there is definitely an element to that comes with being this age and a woman. This is a situation where I'm paying attention to some media that's coming across into my periphery. There's a low need for me to do anything with it and low emotionality. And I have transformed that into a meaningful moment that's hilarious for me, mildly humorous for other people maybe, but it gave me probably a good week or two of fun thinking about that. And that's important because that shows some of the ways that my brain works that I actually enjoy about me, about being maybe autistic or whatever. And this is the happy and the surprise and the playfulness and the creative, and it made me feel energized. So that's no action required and no emotionality. The next segment that I'm going to describe is where there is some action required, but it's not emotional. And this is situations that I could say like self-care tasks, having a shower, getting out of bed, making yourself some food, home chores, cleaning, etc., washing up, and paying bills maybe, or work tasks like taking things to the post office. I create samples in my cosmetic chemistry business. I have to package them up and post them along to my customers. So these are all things that require a level of action that's mine to take. It involves me. They are not inherently emotional tasks. That said, I definitely want to acknowledge, as many of you may be feeling too, that there's a level of emotion that can creep into any of these tasks, but it's not about the task itself. I can find this box, the box that gives me the most, that sends me into emotionality. It doesn't inherently come with emotions to process. So I can be triggered by events that require something of me and that are not inherently emotional. So I can turn a non-emotional situation into a highly emotional situation and elevate the stakes and then dysregulate myself. That is a special kind of awful skill to have, but I'm pretty sure I won't be the only one who feels that. Now, a task for me, like taking samples to the post office, is loaded. I find myself on some days with very low levels of skill in terms of my dexterity, so I can be quite clumsy, my executive processing, so I can forget steps or skip over things, my spatial awareness, so when I'm packaging up boxes of samples, I can choose a box, get everything ready, get the label, and then find that my samples don't fit in the box, or they don't all fit, or they'll fit but they'll squish, or whatever. It's actually quite a challenge for me to complete that task. And that's before I've then got it in the bag, driven it up to the town, stood in line in the post office, and gone through the post office counter. I used to write my labels by hand, and my handwriting when I'm stressed can be quite difficult even for me to read. And so taking things to the post office became a huge challenge for me and a huge struggle, because the guy who I'd often get to process my parcels wouldn't even, in my view, attempt to understand what I'd written. And that being questioned at the time of giving the information over really I used to find it very uncomfortable, and it used to make me quite angry, if I'm being honest, because I had very low emotional intelligence, and anger was pretty much the only one that I knew and could access. That is that box where I do need to act. There's a demand upon me, often coming from myself and me trying to reach my goals and fulfill my life's purpose and my values, like live out my values. I want to be good at work, I want to be able to do this, I want to be able to complete a task. But yes, this is basically a quadrant that I need to be mindful of, that it can turn into an emotional situation. And if I haven't made it clear already, which I probably haven't, emotionality is difficult for me, mine and others, because it doesn't come naturally. I'm not naturally in touch with any of that. So in this box where there's an action required but it's not inherently emotional, I can become emotionally triggered by being autistic and finding that on that particular day when I need to do these tasks, I don't have those skills in my mind. It's like I've lost my mind for a moment, or I just can't process these things. I can start thinking, well, I should be able to do that. I could do that yesterday. Why do I always trip myself up on these simple things? Why does it take so long? It starts to bring in all of that negative self-talk and that anger and disgust, which is basically coming from feeling humiliated about myself and disappointed in myself that I can't live my values. So that's the non-emotional stuff. When I wrote this out and thought of things this way, I was in the mindset that the quadrant that where there's action required by me and it's a highly emotional situation would be the worst situation for me. It would be the most triggering, but it turns out it's not. In this box, this is where I could place things like family distress, personal distress. Maybe I've had something happen to me during the day. I might have fell over, had a physical accident, or been in a conflict situation in work or in another area. I might have been basically left feeling unsafe. There might be a situation with where we live. We live in a bushfire prone area, so it could be a bushfire approaching that is a clear and present danger for myself and my family. This is the situation. There's clearly some action that needs to be taken by me. I'm involved in that action, directly or indirectly, and it's a potentially highly emotional situation. It triggers those basal primal fears. But as I said, I realised fairly quickly that while these situations are very difficult, they're not impossible for me. And in fact, I have a feeling that this is the quadrant where I really can shine, not saying that I'm encouraging the world to send me more of these scenarios, because they are always draining. However, this is the segment that I'd call, the quadrant that I'd call good in a crisis. Once I'm aware of a problem, a situation with high emotionality, high level of action, after that initial freeze, which there always is, and that might only be a nanosecond, but there is always an initial freeze with me, I can then become like a laser sharp focused person. Those situations I can work on. Where that tends to then trip me up is where I can have my monotropism alongside the hyper-focus. So, for example, I might have a situation with what used to happen with my children. Something bad will happen. They'll have a bad day. Something happens. They might be bullied or forgot something or lost something or got a bad mark or something that was quite, emotionally driven. I would meet them in that moment and do what I could or what I thought I needed to do. But instead of then empowering them and having my emotionality sort of cut back a little bit, I'd find myself stuck in that moment. So my children may or may not have got over it or got on with something else, and I'm still elevated. I found it really, really difficult to come down from that. I wasn't and aren't the kind of person who feels the need to then go, right, I'm going to march up to there and take that action. It's not so much that, it's cognitive. It's a cognitive attachment to the trauma and a lack of capacity to process it. So I can be there for that person in that moment and do what I need to do as far as I'm aware, and then find it very difficult myself to come down from that. So I can put my feelings aside while I prioritise the family, the home, the situation. The trouble comes for me afterwards, which can then lead to me burning out. Having said that, but this quadrant is somewhat easier than the next one. The last quadrant I want to talk about is where there's no action required of me. Action is somewhat optional, but there is a lot of emotion in the situation. And I'm actually going to use an example of a parable from the Bible it's for this. I don't, while I say that, I'm thinking, don't turn off, I'm not going to preach to you. When I was growing up, I went to school at a Church of England school, as was fairly common back then, and we had religious assemblies. We were told stories from the Bible, that kind of thing. We did a bit of religious education in our day-to-day. We used to go to the church for all the cultural ceremonies, and there was Sunday school, etc. I grew up as a cultural Christian, I suppose you'd say, so this was all part of my cultural upbringing, and the stories were taken in the same vein for me as I would take any other story that I was told. So it was a cultural story, this time about a guy called Jesus, and in this case the parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm going to read this off my computer here because there's a lot to say, and it is quite a difficult, this is my most difficult segment, so I need to read it so I don't go off track. A few years ago, I found myself in court supporting someone who was close to me. The process was arduous and painful. I didn't necessarily need to be there, but I was because I wanted to support my person, and I felt this is what Jesus would have done. I feel I must make it clear that I was compelled more by a here and now duty or desire than any thoughts of what might happen to me in the afterlife, how I might be rewarded for acting this way. It doesn't enter my mindset. It was only on reflection that I thought people might think that's why I did this, but that's not true. I'm much more comfortable with being turned into compost, to be honest, than I am with the thought of going to another place, heaven, filled with people, different social norms and clothing that I didn't choose, the white outfits of heaven. For me, and I'm sure for the person who I was with and everyone else who's ever been involved, court felt brutal. It's a place that quite literally put me through the ringer, leaving me feeling like my innards had been squashed to bursting point. The process that I was involved in, that I was part of, I guess, in terms of supporting my person, continued for quite a few months, between hearings and mentions, and during that time I struggled to sleep, to work, and even to function. But still I persisted because somewhere inside me the idea lived this idea that Jesus taught us to reach out and help each other and be there for each other, especially people close to you. This is where the Good Samaritan comes in. I remember hearing this story more than once in assembly as I sat cross-legged on the cold floor, scratching my eczema, trying to stop my stomach from groaning and my mind from counting down the minutes until the bell, recess, and a chance to stuff my face with packets of crisps. The message of that story has stayed with me for over 40 years in the form of a highly literal, self-sacrificing manifesto. The Good Samaritan is my example of taking things very literally. What is said is what is meant. My internalised version of the Good Samaritan story has none of the subtle nuances of the Bible story. The 8-year-old me had missed the part prior to finding the beaten-up man by the side of the road. The prelude being where a lawman is talking and trying to test Jesus and his help your neighbour stance in an attempt to find an easier way into heaven. I also missed the subtle dig at our human prejudice that came with it being the Samaritan rather than the priest or the temple worker who helped the poor person by the side of the road. During Jesus' time, the Samaritans were seen by many Jews as the enemy, them having an alternative take on history and sites of religious significance. Instead, all I'd remembered from the story is that Jesus wanted us to help everybody without judgment or precondition, and that's what I became programmed to try, and I must emphasise the try, to do. So how did this literal help everyone stance play out for me? Unlike the lawman questioning Jesus, I've always found it easy to act from a non-judgmental position. It doesn't occur to me to game the situation or to be strategic. And I do believe that speaks more to my autism than to the inherent goodness of my character. In that way, I mean that my autism makes this my norm rather than it being a choice that I've had to actively pursue. And it's a lot easier to act according to your true nature than it is to go against your self-interest, I guess. So that's what I'm saying there. While I can't remember it ever occurring me to assess the other person's inherent value before deciding if to lend a hand, it typically does occur to me to assess and weigh up the objective risks as I find them. There's a process for that, you see. That's another thing that I learnt from my childhood, and this time during my time at the St. John's First Aiders. They have a triangle, the DRS ABCD, which is danger, response, and then send for help, airways, breathing, CPR, defib. There's no point in us both dying in the process. Forgetting myself. It's easy for me, to forget myself. I don't mean that in the sense of that I don't have my own sense of identity or that I have a poor sense of who I understand, I can describe myself and I know myself that way, but it's more, where my boundaries start and stop, that sort of thing. Autism and trauma, both caused by my neurodiversity and by other life happenings, my lower emotional intelligence and my weaker personal boundaries, or my non-instinctual personal boundaries, I should say, create the perfect conditions for me to turn myself into a human doing rather than a human being. And that's why that saying is something I often come back to. I think of myself as strong, resilient and capable on account of my physical muscle power, my mental strength and capacity, my history in overcoming and thriving in the face of adversity, and my higher than average energy reserves and intellect. Pair that with a disconnected emotional landscape and you've got yourself a rescue robot. Ooh. I've lost myself in the process of helping others many times and ended up burnt out, traumatised and unable to function for months at a time. It's only now that I'm starting to understand that Jesus probably didn't mean for me to take his Samaritan story so literally. The story of the Good Samaritan sits in this, my most challenging of boxes. This is the box with less learnable scripts, the box that is overflowing in the world. So many people are in need, so few Good Samaritans. The box is loaded with friction due to the empathy gap that exists between me, the autistic Samaritan, and you, the person asking for help. Just thinking about scenarios that meet the need for this box sends my anxiety and stress levels through the roof. As many of us know, our wise, rational mind deserts us when we're that elevated. It's a recipe for disaster, really, and at this stage I'm only focused on the pre-action emotions. There's still the during help fear to work with, and then the post-help sadness at the loneliness that accompanies my inevitable burnout. We may help as a team, but we burn out alone. I now understand that I'm vulnerable, sensitive, and have severe blind spots when it comes to evaluating my own physical capacity and resilience, thanks to sensory processing issues and struggles around proprioception, interoception, and understanding societal norms and my own boundaries. In the story, the Good Samaritan washed the victim's wounds before carrying them to an inn and paying for their care. I remember these details being told to us in a way that definitely emphasised the effort the Samaritan put into the situation. But it didn't ever occur to me that this gargantuan, energy-zapping, all-in, life-on-the-line effort that I was imagining may have only actually been a strenuous yet temporary and ultimately recoverable good deed for the Samaritan. He might have only taken a cup of tea and a solid night's rest to get over that, whereas for me, I could have been stuck in meltdown, shutdown for weeks, if not months. The realisation that it's not just right and respectful for me to acknowledge and assess my capacity and resources as part of my how, why, when and where prelude to lending a hand to others is essential has only just sunk in for me. This isn't because of a feeling of inadequacy or inherent unworthiness on my part. Rather, it's an example of my tendency towards the literal, in-the-moment interpretation of a situation, and one that's then fed by my monotropic processes and patterns, which ensure that once I'm on a track, I'll struggle to get off. I'd say that this is me taking it literally, what is said is what is meant, both in the beginning, initially, and continually. So it becomes a concrete idea in my head as opposed to an example of a doorway through which I can go and then ask more questions. So instead of it being a dynamic idea, it becomes a stuck idea. And I think that's highly significant for me as somebody with autism, that I internalized a concrete block of, well, you just always help people, you just always help people, forgetting that dynamic situations require dynamic solutions and thinking, and that should only ever have been the doorway from which I start to make my plan. With respect to boundaries, it's important for me to remember that they're there to mark where I stop and someone or something else begins, and as such they play an important role in relationship building and management, including me managing my response to stress. My leaky sense of where I end saw me extend my literal self to anyone and everyone that came into my sphere with problems or concerns. I'd typically lose myself in the process as I took on their problems as my own. I'd become disorientated as I hyper-focused on them and their life while letting my own resources, wants and needs slip away, even my own safety. More than once, I'd taken the situation to heart far more than the person I was trying to assist, and I'd end up still burnt out for months after they'd recovered and moved on to something else. The answer? You can't help anyone if you're dead. Jesus did not give us a one-line call to arms. He gave us a book full of nuanced stories, scenarios, lessons and anecdotes. The gist of his Samaritan story, as I now understand it, is that we would be mindful not to allow our prejudice and self-preoccupation to blind us from the needs of others. That is very different from saying that we should be self-sacrificing and just help any Tom, Dick or Harry we happen across on the dusty road of life. Or that we should assume that because someone else can do that, that we can do it in exactly the same way. I still can't believe how I took the story of the Good Samaritan very literally this time, but I did, and I have suffered the consequences and also reaped the rewards of doing that, putting myself in situations that perhaps were never for me, but that I have come through, processed, and learnt a great deal from. Just a week or so ago, I was out with one of my friends, and on the way back from our tea and scones date, I was talking about a box of therapy cards that I have that are really, really good, and it's these. It's called the Happiness Trap. I really enjoy these because these are values, goals, barriers cards, and they really do help me think through my emotional landscape because I don't naturally feel these things. So this is really helpful. So I was talking to my friend about these, and then, as happens when you're driving, the conversation paused a moment while we crossed a junction. She was focusing on the traffic, and probably within 20 seconds later, she said to me, "Oh, can you take a picture of the box, please, and then just message it to my phone?" Now, what happened in that moment for me is that I started scanning around the car. I got my phone out of my bag and then started scanning around the car for a box. I couldn't see a box, but then something clicked in my head and I'm like, oh my goodness, Amanda, what are you doing? She's talking about the box of therapy cards. But that gave me just enough time to see how literal I had taken her words. I don't know whether it was because I had done my bit of the call, if you like, the call and response to the conversation. So I had explained that I've got these great cards, and then there was a gap. I don't know whether it was the gap that created that disconnect in my brain, or whether my brain tends to disconnect things. But it was interesting, very, very interesting. Now, my friend is trained in mental health issues, and so I felt very, very comfortable. She's my friend. I know that she understands this stuff. I felt very comfortable with telling her what had just happened and how interesting it is for me that being a late diagnosed autistic, that I didn't even know that I did this, and look how crazy I am. Like, why on earth would my brain think that you were talking about a completely different box? But you see, my brain wasn't thinking that she was talking about a different box. My brain was thinking she was talking about a box because that was in our vicinity, because there was no other information. She'd given me a literal instruction in my mind, oh, can you take a picture of the box and message it to my phone? And so I'm going, oh, okay, there must be a box in this car that she needs to look at now, even though that made no sense at all. So that's the example that I want to finish on. And I want to encourage all of you, any of you listening that find this interesting, to think about maybe how you could think about your own thinking. It's quite hard to intercept our thoughts because they happen. Thoughts like that, taking that literally, where I'm thinking there's a box and it's not, whatever, that sort of scenario doesn't escalate for me automatically into me feeling bad about myself or whatever. It only ever escalates for me if I have a lot of those occasions in a short period of time, like I'm having a day of it. And by the end of the day, or by the time I've done that sort of thing 10 or so times, it becomes less amusing and more tiring, because it highlights to me the extra effort. For whatever reason, only nobody's ever going to know, maybe, my brain does that, when it was clearly much more likely that my friend in that situation was talking about the same thing that I was talking about. I don't know why that happens, I still don't, but I found that interesting. I am very grateful for that situation being a low emotional situation and a situation where I felt very safe, that it gifted me the opportunity to look in the moment and process and go, aha, look, this is an example of me taking things very literally. So on that, I want to end. I hope you enjoyed, or at least some of the examples resonated with you, how where as an autistic person I can and do take things very literally, and I can and do take a literal concept sometimes and turn it into a concrete block, and that's where I can then end up acting in a way that is outside of my values, usually to my own detriment as opposed to anyone else's. And as a way that someone who's autistic can play with words and ideas and enjoy non-literal interpretations. So to say that autistic people take things literally, I think, is a great disservice to all of us, that it is contextual, relationship based and dynamic, and it very much depends on how safe we feel, where the demands are coming from, and what resources we have at any given time to attend to that. Thank you very much.